name's Karen Willis, and I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker. Lydia X.C. Brown is an advocate, organizer, and writer whose work has focused on violence against disabled people in schools, institutions, prisons, and by police. They have especially worked to support disabled people at many margins, including people of color and LGBTQ people with disabilities. They have worked to transform systems and change the culture throughout community organizing, public speaking, and peer training, policy advocacy, and challenging the status quo. Lydia is the lead editor along with Mori, Nikki, Giwa Awa, and Ashikasi of All the Way of Our Dreams, the first ever anthology by autistic people of color. They also design and teach a course on disability and social movements at Tufts University as a visiting lecturer. Lydia is also a founding board member of the Alliance for Citizens Directive Supports, which advocates for all people with disabilities to have full community integration and control over their services. They are part of the Autism Women's Network Board and the National Disability Leadership Alliance Task Force on Racism and Disability Advocacy. Additionally, Lydia has been the chairperson of the Massachusetts Developmental Disabilities Council from 2015 to 2017. Lydia has been honored by the White House, Washington D.C. National Council on Independent Living and Disability Policy Consultorium. Their work has been featured in numerous community, academic, and news media, and they blog at Autistic Hoya. Please give a warm welcome to Lydia X.C. Brown.
Is the microphone on? Wave at me if you can hear me, and keep waving people next to you. See if they're waving, and if them are not, loudly yell the word fuck. Can you check? Okay, I think haven't heard one fuck. We're probably okay. Excellent. You know exactly what kind of health I have. I will, let's see. I think this is not working. Switch to the handheld. Okay, let's do that. Switch to the handheld. Okay, not going in or out. You can all hear me. Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me and welcoming me to the great state of Alabama, which I've never been to before. It is state number 32. Who here is from the Alabama hosting group? The folks here. Thank you to your planning and organizing and making today happen. I made it, somehow. We'll leave the details up to airlines and people that are not me. I am notoriously bad at directions and navigation. Last year I was with a friend and we managed to get separated on opposite sides of a national border in countries that are separated by a body of water and where different languages are spoken. And as I heard customs making announcements, I'm just thinking, oh shit. So, much appreciation to you for making sure that I actually made it here. Now that you know who I am, a little bit about me and the kind of person that I am, which is to say, not a stuffy and pretentious person, or I try hard not to be, I want to open today with an invitation and an invocation. That's how I like to begin any kind of a presentation that I'm sharing space with folks. So you'll see on the slide here, it says access no. And there's images of people lying down, walking around. One person is flat out on the floor. And it says to you, please use this space as you need or prefer. Sit in chairs or on the floor, pace, lie on the floor, flap, rock, spin, move around, come in and out of the room as you need. We are all taught all the time that there's only one correct way to show that we're paying attention. I don't believe in that. I don't accept that. We are taught that there's only one way to show that we care, that we are respectful, that we are obedient. We are taught obedience as a virtue. I don't believe in obedience as a virtue. I believe in non-compliance as a virtue. So that applies here, in the space that we're in. You don't have to stay seated at these tables. You don't have to remain looking up this way if you don't feel comfortable doing that, if that's not how you learn. But of course you are welcome to. I can then sort of see your faces from far. It doesn't really do much for the two of us, so do what makes your body feel comfortable. Do what makes you feel like you are able to exist in this space, because we all deserve to be here. We deserve to exist as we are, without any conditions, without any obligations, without any limitations on whether or not we get to count as fully human. So I want to ask us to take a moment, as I often do, to ground ourselves by tuning into our own bodies. Let's listen to what our own bodies are telling us. Are you here this morning and you're excited? Are you still hungry? Like, theoretically you shouldn't be, but maybe you are. Maybe you're entering into a food coma. Perhaps you're anxious. Perhaps you're wondering, who did we invite that just used the F word twice? Was that a mistake? Should someone go get the shepherd cane and start dragging this person off the stage? But to tune in for a moment to what our bodies and minds are telling us about where we are at. Let's meet ourselves where we're at. Sometimes folks like to close their eyes for this, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. I cherish rule breaking. But I'm going to ask us to take that moment. Let's tune into ourselves and listen to what our own bodies are telling us. Thank you. The reason that I ask us to do this at the beginning of nearly every workshop or presentation is because it's a practice of disability justice. It's a practice of respecting and honoring our own bodies, giving ourselves permission to feel all that is happening inside our brain, to feel the full range of our anger, of our frustration, of our sadness, of our anxieties, and of our joys. To give ourselves permission to be who and all that we are, to feel all that we have, without somebody else pointing a finger at us and wagging and saying, that's inappropriate. Or telling us, that's unprofessional, that's immature. This is not a venue or a phone room where you should display your feelings that way. This is our space. You have come here from some very large number of states. I went to law school, I don't do math. Perhaps there's folks here from outside the United States. Is there anyone here internationally in the room? I see a few hands over, mostly in that corner, to my right, your left. And how many of you are not from Alabama? All right, so it's a lot of folks that came from not this state. How many of you had to get on a plane to come here? That's a lot of people who had to get on a lot of planes. We probably confused the TSA quite a lot. I don't feel bad. How many of you had to get in a car and drive for more than 4 hours to get here? I am so sorry. Last summer, my partner and I drove from Central Florida to upstate New York in just 2 days. It sucked. I do not envy you, but I am glad that you are here, and I am excited that you are so motivated and willing and determined to make it here, that you suffered through a hellish driving experience. I'm going to call it hellish. Maybe you enjoyed it. I'm projecting my experiences onto you now. I want to give you another note that during the rest of our time here together this morning, I will be talking about some issues of abuse or violence, especially in the beginning. So if you feel that you need to take a break from that, you are welcome to do that. I will not be offended if you need to come in or out of the room. I will not be offended if you realize that you are no longer able to participate in our space. But I want to give that heads up because I know that as the vast majority of us here are people with disabilities or disabled people, that many of us have survived forms of abuse or violence. That there are folks here who have survived or directly are confronting the things that I'm going to be talking about. So I don't want to act like or assume or pretend that this is all stuff that happens away from us, that doesn't affect us. I know it does. I know this affects us and the people we care about and those that are close to us. So I want to give you that heads up, and that's the image on this slide as of someone yelling into a megaphone, "Content warning," just in case it was not clear. I want to talk to you today about what disability justice means for our movement as self-advocates. And what that really comes back to is how our movement is not, but must be, aligned with and working with other movements and other communities. So, one of the most awkward things whenever I'm speaking anywhere is when people are like, "Let's applaud because this is awesome," and I'm like, "Oh, great. People like it. Great. They don't hate me, and also I shouldn't be talking while people are applauding or no one will hear me, and then everybody will be sad." I want to talk about some realities that we face. We know about many of them. We know that rates of sexual violence against our community are extraordinarily high. That depending on the estimates you look at, between 83 to the mid-90% of people considered women with intellectual and developmental disabilities will be sexually assaulted at least once in their or our lifetimes. That over half of that number will be sexually assaulted at least 10 times by the age of 18 alone. That for people who are labeled as men, which probably includes both men and some non-men, that number is close to 40%. That's the estimate. These estimates are over 2 decades old. They're probably underestimates. We know that many of us, our friends and our colleagues and our comrades, have been paid some minimum wage in sheltered workshops, and that this is still completely legal in the United States under the Fair Labor Standards Act, Section 14C. We know that our community is told that these sheltered workshops are a kind of opportunity. Can you hear the sarcasm in my voice? They're an opportunity. They give you something meaningful to do with your day. Great, it's meaningful to sort popsicle sticks and take home $5? Does that sound meaningful to you? No. Does that sound like an opportunity to you? No. And yet, that is the reality we live with. In the United States of America, there are only a few categories of human beings who are legally allowed to be paid less than minimum wage. And that includes people with disabilities, it includes people in prisons, and it includes some groups of agricultural workers, people working on farms, people who live in the country, people who are often lower income, who are black, who are brown, and who may or may not have a disability. People in prison. The group HEARD, helping educate to advance rights of deaf communities, estimates that 70+%, that's 70+% of all people in prisons are either deaf or have a disability. They estimate that that's the same percentage, it's a more updated percentage than the one on this poster, are the percentage of people who are killed by police, that they estimate that 70 to 80% are deaf or have a disability. That includes people who have a mental illness. And so that means that in the United States of America, if you are a black person or you are an indigenous person and you have a disability, that you are at the highest likelihood of being targeted for violence by the state. Every year, every month, every day, I move through my life finding constantly from people who know me, people who follow my work, people who follow the folks that I follow, that someone else has been murdered by police. And almost always, we find out that they were black, they were Native American, and they were disabled, or they had some form of a disability. Almost every single time. I'm autistic. I know that there are other folks in the room who might be autistic or have autism. Is that true, right? I'm not the only one. And people with our disabilities, so all of you that just raised your hands, all of us that are under the umbrella of autism, we are likely to die 3 decades younger than people who are not disabled at all. The second leading cause of our deaths is suicide. The second leading cause of our deaths is suicide. In schools, nationally, restraint, seclusion, aversive discipline are used disproportionately on people like us, people with disabilities, who are also statistically either black or Latinx. Some folks might, Latinx or might be classified under the label Hispanic. That's the label that's often used in the data. So if you were both of those things and you were in a school, you were at risk, according to our own United States federal government in a report they published in 2009, likely to be subjected for severe injury or death for the crime of existing in a non-compliant, unruly body. Restraint and seclusion remain legal in many states. Corporal discipline remains legal in at least a handful of states. Aversive interventions remain legal in many states. In Massachusetts, how many of you know about the Judge Rotenberg Center? And how many of you are like, no, what is that and how bad is it? That is some folks who don't know, right? The Judge Rotenberg Center is an institution. It's in Massachusetts. It opened in 1971. They are notorious internationally for the use of painful electric shock as punishment on people with disabilities. The man who founded the institution invented his own device. He designed it to be more powerful and painful than a police taser. The people who are confined in this institution, who are subjected to the shocks, have to wear a backpack that has electrodes that come out of it that are taped to their body. And when they do anything that staff does not like, they receive a shock. They can receive shocks for getting out of their seat without permission, for closing their eyes without permission, for trying to hold somebody's hand, for raising their hand to speak, for saying a swear word. I would have just been shocked at the JRC several times in the last 10 minutes. It's funny, right? But it's also not funny. The JRC has killed 6 people that we know of since it opened. And it's perfectly legal. In fact, it's so legal, it's so authorized and sanctioned by our government that every time a person is allowed to receive the shocks, a judge signs the order. A judge in court signs the order. The United Nations has condemned the Judge Rotenberg Center twice. The United Nations has condemned it twice. And yet, people with disabilities are still there. And yet, while we're here today sharing community, there are other people with disabilities who are being shocked and terrified and terrorized. Does that sound fair to you? No. Does this sound just to you? No. And yet, this is what we live with. That this is legal, it's sanctioned, and it's defended by so-called experts with degrees. I've learned that degrees don't mean much. A lot of people who claim to be experts on the lives of people with disabilities, but who are actually non-disabled, who don't want to learn what it's like to live our lives, who don't respect us as adults, they have letters called PhD after their name. And I've learned that PhD often stands for pretty huge douchebag. And MDs being the medical doctor folks, who 4 years ago at the Food and Drug Administration in Maryland held a hearing to decide whether or not they should think about maybe banning the shocks. And during that hearing, someone with a PhD after his name questioned whether autistic people can feel pain. While several of us were sitting there in the room, and I was just sitting there thinking, I really cannot get an arrest record today. I cannot get an arrest record today. I have an international flight in a day, and if I get arrested, it's gonna be like bad. But I really, really want to. So what does all of this have in common for us? It has in common that what it shows us is that our lives are marked constantly by discrimination, by abuse, by violence, and that where that comes down is often by telling us that our lives aren't valuable, that we don't deserve to be here, that we'd be better off dead than disabled. By telling us, when we put you in the category of disability, we are assuming that that's incompatible with humanity. That's what society tells us. And that often, in fact, almost always plays out with and across many of our identities and experiences. Because you know, as we're here right now this morning, we're not the same people. We're not the same person. Up here, Karen and I, we're not the same person. We've not lived the same life. We don't have the same experiences. We don't have all the same identities, even though we do share a disability, which is quite awesome. Or AU, awesome, if you want to take it that way. Right, and we're also LGBT, right? But each of us that is in this room, we don't all share the same identities. There are ways in which I experience some privilege in society that some folks here do not. And there are ways that many of you might experience privilege in society that I do not. But we're all here because we have a common identity. We have a common identity, we have a common concern, and yet we're not here as the same people. We're not here representing the same communities. I'm often in disability space where I'm the only person of color. I'm the only openly queer person. Or I'm in a queer space, an LGBTQ space, and I'm the only person with a disability there. No one else is disabled, just me. I'll be in a space where we're organizing around racial justice. We're all people of color, Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian, and mixed race, and I'm the only disabled person. I'm the only one that's willing to be out about the fact that I'm disabled. And what that says to me is that as much as we talk a lot about working together, about unity, about solidarity, they're really just buzzwords. We don't often follow through. In fact, usually we fail. So the image that's on this slide before I turn it, it's a photograph of myself and my partner, and we're holding signs protesting the Judge Rotenberg Center. It says, "Stop the shocks." And there's a few other signs that talk about how awful it is. It's from January 2013, and unfortunately not old. Disability justice is a way of thinking about our movement and our activism that moves beyond single issue organizing. That says, how can we do disability activism that puts at its center cross-community organizing. So I want to go through a few different definitions of what disability justice means. This is from Talila Lewis, who is the founder of the group I mentioned earlier, Helping Educate to Advance the Rights of Deaf Communities, and a co-founder of a group called the Harriet Tubman Collective, which is an all-black group of deaf and disabled activists. And TL defines disability justice as honoring the whole humanity of every person. Honoring the whole humanity. Disability justice means see me as a human and see me as an Asian. See me as a disabled person. See me as a trans and gender non-conforming person. See me for all of who I am. Don't say, well, I just see you as a person. I don't have to worry about that other stuff. Then you're not seeing me as a whole person. You're not. Honoring the whole humanity of every person. Don't just ignore or forget about somebody's identity or experience because it's inconvenient or makes you feel uncomfortable to name it. Honor the whole humanity of every person. From Mia Mingus, an organizer in California, Mia Mingus defines disability justice as moving beyond access to wholeness, or as finding home. Now, how many of us are concerned about accessibility and access issues? Right? That should be like most of us. That should be a lot more hands than I'm seeing. That we care about access and accessibility. And we should. Because the world and the society we live in is not accessible to who we are.
Amen.
It's not accessible to how our bodies work. It's not accessible to how our brains work. It assumes that you have to have a certain kind of brain or body to be valuable. That you have to have a certain kind of brain or body to matter in society, and that if you don't, that you're not worth it. That you're disposable. To move from access to wholeness means to say, let's take this society, let's make it accessible, change the culture, make it accessible. But let's also care about supporting the whole of who we are. It's another way of saying what TL did, to support us as whole persons. Sure, there's a ramp, and maybe I can get in if it's a ramp that actually functions, it's not cracked and it's not actually too steep or too narrow, but am I wanted in the place where the ramp leads? You are allowed to go to some community activity, but are you wanted in the place where the community activity takes place? Are you wanted? So to move from access to wholeness means to think about disability activism as not merely, is there a ramp? Is there an invitation? Is there a law? But are we actually wanted and valued in society for who we are? Not merely tolerated. Mikael Lee, an artist and organizer of Washington State, defines disability justice as creating access culture. That means taking the idea of accessibility and putting it in how we do everything. We want to organize a conference? Great. How can we make sure that everyone will feel as safe as possible while there? How can we make sure that we're not forcing every different person with a disability to have to disclose long, detailed, intimate lists of what their accommodations are, probably to be denied? What does it mean to design schools and education that care about supporting us as whole people, not putting us down, not controlling us, not subjecting us to compliance culture, but supporting us as small human beings who need to be taught how to be a decent person with a good moral compass, how to be a good community member, a good civic member, but also how to be able to take charge of their own lives, how to be able to express our own needs, our own desires, and to have that taken seriously, even if it can't be met. To at least have it taken seriously, considered seriously, because we are treated at all ages, whether we have a disability or not, as people whose needs matter. We all deserve to exist and to be loved and to be cared for. We all deserve to exist and to be loved and to be cared for. unfortunately is no longer with us, defined disability justice very simply. He defined it as active love. Active love. We all know, or we have a sense of what we think the word love means. It means caring for somebody, it means being kind to someone, it might mean having a special attachment to them, it might mean having a kind disposition, having a character that is oriented toward helping and supporting other people, toward recognizing them as human. But active love means infusing every moment, everything that we do, with an ethos of love. It means that love must guide and direct us at all times, even when we are angry, and rightfully so. Even when we're confused, or disappointed, or frustrated. Even and especially when we don't know how to work in solidarity with one another. We can still work on loving one another. Loving and supporting one another in recognizing that, our struggles aren't going to go away if I pretend they don't exist. Patricia Byrne from Sins Invalid defines 10 principles of disability justice. I'm not going to read them all. We don't have time to go through all 10. They're listed on the slide. They say intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalist, cross-community organizing, wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. But where I want to start at is the end of that Patricia Byrne emphasizes interdependence. Now, how many of us have been told at some point that we would matter if we could live independently? That's some of us, right? How many of us are trying our best to live independently right now? That's also a lot of us, right? How many of us have been told by somebody, you'll never live independently? That's also a lot of hands, right? And let me ask you, what does that really mean? Disability justice as a broader and more powerful framework for doing disability activism says, you know what, here's a reality. There's nobody who's actually independent. Not a single one of us, not me, not you. We all depend on other people all the time. Like, who flew here again? Who had to get on a plane, right? All of you depended on your pilot being conscious, skilled, and sober. And you should thank your pilot for being sober. Right? How many of you have ever had to get your phone or laptop or tablet fixed? And how many who did it yourself? Okay, that's a couple of people that I'm very impressed by, but most of you did not. I don't. I fixed my computer, I can't fix my phone. I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Right? So how many of you are wearing clothing right now? Right? That should be everyone, right? We're all wearing clothing. Now keep your hand up if you made your clothing. Did you make your clothing that you're wearing? That's a couple people. Okay, if you made the clothes you're wearing, did you do the cutting and the dyeing as well? Did you grow the plants that you got the fibers from, that you wove the cloth with? Maybe you did. If so, I will be even more impressed by you. I've met like one person in all these talks that did, but the reality is most of us haven't. Or if we have, it might have been from one amazing project outfit and not the rest of our clothes. Right? How many of us tried to do our own electrical wiring in the house? Oh, yeah. That's a couple people. Did it succeed? I'm hearing no's. I hope you didn't burn it down. I'm not going to ask. I would probably burn it down. I'm very afraid to touch the wires. I might set something on fire. Perhaps myself. So that's just a sample, right? That we don't live independently. We require other people to do stuff. Now, how many of us have ever gone through a hard time, something traumatic, something devastating? We lost someone that was close to us. Something tragic happened to us, right? That's a lot of us. Now, how many of us, when we had that happen, relied on somebody to cook us some meals? Or to drive us to an appointment, or to go with us to go talk to the doctor, or the police, or the neighbor, right? And that's most of the same hands. And that's because we're not actually independent. Some of us are just more able to do some things on our own, but none of us can do it all on our own. None of us can do it all on our own. So disability justice says we need to embrace interdependence as something valuable and something that's worth working toward. It's not shameful to need help. It's not shameful to not be able to do something on your own. It's not shameful to be dependent. Our society that we live in, a profoundly ableist society, one that fears and hates those of us with disabilities, that society tells us that we should be ashamed if we need help. That there's something wrong with us if we can't do it by ourselves. That we're broken and need to be fixed. But that's wrong. Disability justice says that our interdependence is a valuable commodity. That by living interdependent lives, which we all already do anyway, but by recognizing and treating that as something to be respected, that is part of how we get to our freedom. Disability justice emphasizes the importance of collective access and collective liberation. How do we make it accessible? We help each other to do it. We don't expect the non-disabled people to do it. We're the ones that are there to help and support each other. How do we get to our freedom? We do it with each other. We don't do it alone. We don't do it acting like it's just us as individuals, nor do we do it by acting like it's just this one community. Just let's talk about self-advocacy and let's not talk about anything else. That's not how we do it. And disability justice reminds us that our work always has to be centered on where we all are. My partner, Shane Newmeyer, defines disability justice as making sure we leave nobody behind. I've been saying this quote for a long time, and I finally put my partner's picture in there. And they're not here to see it. But disability justice is making sure we leave nobody behind. It's very easy, and we often do it, to say, well, I got out of the abusive school, so I'm good now. What about everyone else that's still there? What about the fact that it's still standing? I got out of the sheltered workshop, so I'm doing okay, I'm great. I'm not there anymore. But what about the people who are? And what about the fact that it's still there? I'm no longer in the institution. I got out. Okay, but it's literally still there. It's right there. Actually, I don't know where the closest one in Alabama is, so I don't know what I'm pointing at. I'm pointing at the American flag. Seems appropriate. I'm sorry, flag. Sort of. Make sure we leave nobody behind. So in 2016, 2015, wow, okay, so I'm gonna betray my inability to keep track of years. Law school has turned my brain into veritable soup. But at some point in the last few years, we had a Supreme Court decision called Obergefell. Who's heard of Obergefell? You know what that is? And if you don't know what that is, that was a Supreme Court decision that made it law across the land that if you are in a same-gender relationship and you want to get married, you can. So if you are a woman who loves a woman or a man who loves a man, or you are in a relationship that would not have previously been allowed to get married before, you can now in every state. Now you might get some flack for that, depending on where you are and who you tell, but you're legally allowed to. And so a lot of people in a community that I'm part of, a lot of people in the LGBTQ community celebrated this decision. They said, this is amazing. Like, that means that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer people can get married everywhere in the country. That's awesome. But it actually left out people with disabilities. Because as many of us know, if we're receiving services from our state agency, if you get married, you lose your services. Because there's an assumption in the law that, well, you can't possibly be that disabled if you could get married. People who get married can't have disabilities. And that's what? A lie. So say that with me, that's what? A lie. That's what? A lie. Right? relationships. But the law assumes that if you have a disability, especially if it's an intellectual or a developmental disability, that you can't understand what that means. That you can't understand what it means to be in love or to have a relationship. So if you're dating someone, they must be taking advantage of you.
Yeah.
And that's not true. Many of us have been in, perhaps some of us are currently, in abusive relationships. And that unfortunately is a common experience. We're often exploited, we're often targeted, we are often particularly vulnerable to abuse. But we are capable of making our own decisions and understanding our own lives, making our own choices about who we want to be dating, or I guess if you're more old-fashioned, who you want to court. My parents did that. It's interesting. So make sure we leave nobody behind means if we're celebrating a victory or a progress, make sure that that's actually a victory for all of us, and not just some. Obergefell was a victory, don't get me wrong, it was a victory. That changed the law across this entire country, but it wasn't a victory for us all. How I've defined disability justice is as the art and practice of honoring the body and mind, or of honoring all body minds. That means that our bodies deserve to be respected, that our brains deserve to be respected, that whether we matter or are worthy or valuable in society shouldn't depend on an IQ test, shouldn't depend on what our legs can do, shouldn't depend on whether or not we can read or how we read, shouldn't depend on whether or not we can finish school or go to college or not. Great, you can go to college, awesome. Someone else can't go to college, also cool. We all deserve to be here, and none of us is more valuable than another. However our brains or bodies work, whatever's going on in there, it deserves to exist. You deserve to exist.
Amen.
We all deserve love and care. What the world we live in tells us that we do not. So there was a word, it was back here on the Patricia Byrne slide, where she defines 10 principles of disability justice. And the very first one is intersectionality. Who's heard of that term before in the room? And who's like, what the hell are you talking about? Okay, that's some other people, right? And some people are like, maybe, kind of, I feel like I've heard this, but like, do not ask me to define it. Like, that's also some people, right? So intersectionality as a term entered into public conversation in the early 90s. It was created by the person here on the slide, Professor Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. She wrote about it in this paper, the title of it is there, Mapping the Margins. It was about violence against women of color, specifically about violence against Black women. And she came up with the term intersectionality to describe what happens when you can't explain the discrimination, the prejudice, or as some of us will call it, the oppression that someone experiences by only thinking about it from one angle. In her paper, she wrote about how violence against Black women cannot be understood as just sexism or as just racism, but that it was a particular blend of both, that racism and sexism mixed to target the Black woman that she was writing about, that they couldn't be separated, that it blended and created a form of oppression or of discrimination that is different from either sexism as white women experience it or racism as Black men experience it. Does that make sense? So intersectionality has come to be used, and I attended a talk from Professor Crenshaw this year, last year, sometime in the last couple years. Law school really did make everything soup. I don't remember when anything was. Which is possibly a good thing under the current administration, but who knows? She wrote, and she has said now, intersectionality has been used now, is used, she uses it as well, to analyze what happens when individuals or whole communities face multiple forms of oppression, multiple forms of discrimination, multiple forms of prejudice. What happens when they blend? So ableism Some of us may have used this term, some have not. I like this term a lot. In the UK, many people with disabilities prefer to say disableism. Long semantic argument we don't have time for. But I will tell you that ableism is a whole system of thinking and doing that hurts disabled people or people with disabilities. It's a whole system of thinking and doing that hurts us. It is a form of structural oppression. That means that there's a power difference in society. The people that are labeled with disability are deprived of power, and the people that are considered functional and healthy and not disabled are given power in society. That's power that we experience individually when a service provider makes decisions for you and stops you from living your life, and it's power on the broad scale in society that keeps the Judge Rotenberg Center operating. Ableism is racist at its core. It doesn't exist without racism. Ableism is capitalist because it tells us we matter if we work and if we can earn a certain amount of money. If you're productive, you matter in society. We say this a lot as self-advocates. We say, I matter as a citizen because I work too. You shouldn't have to work to be valuable. Because you're valuable if you're sick at home in bed. You're valuable if you're lying on the couch. You're valuable if you've lost your job. You're valuable if you've never got a job. Our value is not determined or defined by our production. Ableism also says we're going to define people by whether we think they deserve to exist in this society. That is why ableism is entwined with the history of white supremacy in the United States of America. At every possible turn, whether used to justify enslavement of black Africans, by also saying that if a black African tried to escape enslavement, they had a mental illness called drapetomania, whether it was used to justify keeping East Asians, and particularly the Chinese, out of the country by saying they're going to bring their diseases and all their dirty foods over here, and they're going to behave like animals. There were cartoons published in leading newspapers in the 1900s that showed Asians looking like monkeys, a very familiar racist trope. We use it now. We hear this ableism and how our president is talking about people coming over the border, saying that those people aren't animals, they're savages. Those are people that are scary. We're really just talking about a gang, you know, but you're using a gang as a stand-in. You're connecting this gang to the rest of the immigrants. You're also saying should be shut out. You're saying they're like animals. This is ableism. They're like animals. That means their brains aren't up to ours. That means that their brains aren't worthy. They don't function the way we think they ought to. Ableism is racist. Ableism is capitalist. Ableism is eugenicist. Ableism says we don't want more people like you to exist anymore. When someone is pregnant says, all I want is a healthy baby, we often know that that means they assume a baby that won't have autism, a baby that won't have Down syndrome, a baby that won't have cerebral palsy or spinal bifida, a baby that won't be blind or deaf, a baby that will grow up to be a non-disabled person. But that's often what they need. And they usually don't mean it as an attack. They will say, well, I don't mean it to attack you. It's not like I think anything bad about you. I just want my child to have as good a life as they possibly can. In the world we live in, who gets to have a good life is determined often by how society targets those at its margins for violence and erasure. Ableism is oppression. That means that it's power differences in society, it's prejudice, it's bias, it's bigotry, it can be hate. It's not always outright hate, but it often is, and it's power. Mia Mingus, again, says that ableism is connected to all of our struggles because it undergirds notions of whose bodies are considered valuable, desirable, and disposable. Who is considered to be compliant? Who is considered to be intelligent? Who is considered to be healthy or functional? Or TL will add, excellent. Who is considered excellent? Arundhati Roy, a writer from India, says that this is what oppression does, oppression like ableism and other forms of oppression. There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. The deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. People always tell us that we don't have a voice. They need to speak for us. There's even an entire group that many of us know and loathe, VOR. You know VOR? Voice of the, you know what comes next.
Voice of reason.
It's voice of the R words. It's voice of the R words. It's a group of parents, none of whom have disabilities, who claim that they speak for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This happens to us across our lifespans where other people claim to speak for us, they speak over us, they claim that we don't and can't have voices. And in fact, that if we speak, they will say to me, you, Lydia Brown, you're speaking. Because you're speaking, you can't possibly have a disability. Because you are speaking, you can't possibly be trusted to talk about disability issues. You only have like your own experience and you're probably very high functioning. I've gone like up to 4 days without eating anything because I wasn't able to make food. I frequently don't remember that time exists, and I have had some really bad experiences. But you know, I'm supposed to be very high functioning, despite the fact that I apparently can't reliably feed myself, because I'm speaking here. It's just a tactic. It's a distraction. We don't need to pay attention to the details. The details don't matter. If they want to say, Lydia, your voice doesn't matter because you're speaking in a room, it doesn't really matter what I say in response to that. They've already convinced themselves it's true, and it's just a tactic to say, we're going to silence you so that your voice will not be heard. This is true across oppressions. We're often told that as people with disabilities, that we can be valuable in society if we inspire non-disabled people. Or if we're the background prop in someone else inspiring non-disabled people. Tear-jerking story of what 5th grader did for a classmate with autism. Get out the Kleenex. Courageous 11th grader asked girl with Down syndrome to prom to give her experience of a lifetime. New person with some intellectual disability is having a job at this place and brings joy and smiles to everyone in the office. We've all seen these headlines, right? Yeah. We've seen these memes. Yeah. And they're dehumanizing. Yeah. They're supposedly positive stories, but they're really rooted in saying you matter only in as much as you make non-disabled people feel good. Because they didn't call you the R words, they get points for that. No. That's the measure we're using for decency. They didn't say the R word. They didn't directly physically attack us. So then we're gonna say they're great, they're a hero, they're brave. That's inspiration porn, and it's used against us all the time. Yeah. And we also hear the same stories used about poverty, used about race, used about gender. Or we'll say like, you know, boy from the hood, expected to live life of crime, suddenly goes to Harvard. Okay, why are you like, how is it that you can be so racist in this one headline that's supposedly so positive? A lot of times I read the news and it's impressive that I haven't broken more phones. Throwing across the room. Right, oppression works in similar patterns across identities. It works in similar patterns. We say, oh, as a person with a disability, we'll treat you with respect if you overcome it. If you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you don't let it affect you anymore. You can get over it. You can learn to hide the disability, and then we'll say you should be respected. And we hear the very same thing along class and racial and gender lines. Well, you can be respected once people forget that you're a woman. You can be respected once you're so articulate that someone will forget that you are Black or Latinx. You can be respected once you have letters after your name so that we can ignore that you grew up with no money. Then you're respected. to place conditions on acceptance and respect. To place conditions on it by saying, if you achieve something that we assume is not possible for your group, whether or not it is, we assume it's not, then we'll respect it. That's a moralizing narrative. It says it's your fault. If you don't have a job and aren't living independently, it's your fault because you didn't try hard enough to overcome it. And that kind of narrative cuts across oppression more often than not. We often act on this, I'm going to show a visual version of this as well, through what I call disavowal, otherwise known as throwing each other under the bus. So here's an example of what that looks like. In this image, there's a group of people protesting for their rights, for equality, for justice. And there's someone that's with the group of protesters who's saying, no, not you, get away, to someone who's homeless sitting on the ground panhandling. And what this shows is the idea of what happens when we say, I want my rights, and as soon as I got my rights, we're good. Not you. Not those people over there. We do it all the time. Many people in the autistic community, right, will say, if they don't have an intellectual disability, well, you know, I deserve to be accepted because autism is like a difference, and it's not like I have an intellectual disability. And I'm like, did you hear what you just said? You said that some autistic people get to count as human beings, but another group of autistic people doesn't. I hear it from people who don't have mental disabilities but do have physical disabilities say to me, to my face, yeah, you know, I use this wheelchair like I have like XYZ physical disability, but my mind is fine. And I'm like, I'm literally right here. Hi, I'm autistic, I'm mentally ill, and I'm right here when you said that. Your mind is fine, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? It's the history of my community as an East Asian, as an Asian American, where we've been told Asian Americans can count in society. We can count in America if we embrace the model minority myth and throw Black, Native American, and Latinx people under the bus. If you, Lydia, you and other Asians choose to identify with whiteness, identify with white people, and don't work in solidarity with your fellow